That bloating that starts before you even finish eating. The fatigue that hits at 2 in the afternoon. Every single day. No matter how well you slept. The joint stiffness that wasn't there 5 years ago. You've been told it's just aging. Your doctor has run tests, found nothing alarming, and moved on. But here's what most people never hear. These aren't separate problems. They share a single origin. And that origin is not your age. 7 specific foods, backed by research you've probably never seen summarized in one place, can begin reversing this at the source. Not in months, in weeks. This video is about what's actually happening inside your gut after 50, and exactly what to do about it. Most people assume their gut is a passive participant in their health, something that processes food, causes occasional trouble, and otherwise stays quiet. That assumption is costing them more than they know. Your gut lining is a single layer of cells, thinner than a sheet of paper, stretched across nearly 30 feet of intestinal surface. On one side, everything you've ever eaten, every medication you've ever taken, every environmental toxin your body has processed for the past 50+ years. On the other side, your bloodstream, your immune system, your brain. Between those two worlds, that one fragile layer. And here's what nobody explains clearly. Nearly 70% of your entire immune system lives in and around your gut. Not in your lungs, not in your lymph nodes, in your gut. The cells that decide what's a threat and what isn't, the ones that regulate systemic inflammation across your entire body, they get their information from what's happening in your intestinal lining, every hour of every day. When that lining is healthy, it filters with extraordinary precision. Nutrients in, waste out. The system runs so smoothly, you never notice it. But when that lining is compromised, when the junctions between those thin cells start to loosen, the filtering breaks down. Things that should stay in your gut don't. Bacterial fragments, partially digested proteins, compounds that your immune system immediately recognizes as foreign. They slip through. The scientific term for this is intestinal permeability. You've probably heard the more colloquial version, leaky gut. The term sounds almost casual, like something you solve with a probiotic and move on. It isn't. Increased intestinal permeability is increasingly linked in peer-reviewed research to chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind that doesn't announce itself with acute pain, but shows up instead as joint stiffness that wasn't there at 45, brain fog that clouds the afternoon, energy that disappears before dinner. What makes the situation in adults over 50 particularly significant is the cumulative nature of it. Decades of NSAIDs for joint pain, years of stress-driven cortisol elevation, dietary patterns that were never designed around gut microbiome health because the science wasn't there yet. All of it lands on that single fragile layer, and all of it compounds. But here's the part your doctor rarely has time to explain. That layer regenerates. Rapidly. Your intestinal cells replace themselves on a cycle of roughly 5 to 7 days. The lining you have today is not the one you'll have next week, which means what you eat this week is already building the version of your gut lining that exists a week from now. The question is no longer whether your gut can heal. The biology confirms that it can. The question is whether you're giving it what it needs to do so, or whether you're unknowingly working against a system that's trying to repair itself every single day. The 7 foods in this video were selected because they do something most Healthy foods don't. They act directly on the mechanisms of gut barrier repair. Not generally, specifically. The difference between eating well and eating with intention is what this video is about. Imagine a garden where the soil has been depleted for years. You can plant the most expensive seeds available, but if the soil doesn't have what it needs to support root growth, nothing flourishes. The seeds aren't the problem. The foundation is. Your gut microbiome works on exactly that principle. Except the soil is the ecosystem of bacteria living along your intestinal wall, and the seeds are the foods that either feed the right organisms or starve them. Inside a healthy gut, certain strains of bacteria perform a specific and critical function. They ferment dietary fiber and produce short-chain fatty acids as a byproduct. The most important of these is butyrate. Butyrate isn't a supplement. It isn't something you consume directly in meaningful amounts. It's something your gut bacteria manufacture for you, but only when you give them the right raw material to work with. Here's why butyrate matters so much. The cells lining your colon, the enterocytes, use butyrate as their primary fuel source. Not glucose, not fat from your bloodstream. Butyrate. When butyrate-producing bacteria are abundant and well-fed, those cells thrive. When those bacteria are depleted by low-fiber diets, by repeated antibiotic use, by the steady reduction in bacterial diversity that accompanies decades of typical Western eating, the enterocytes start to starve. And starving cells can't maintain the tight junctions that keep your gut lining intact. This is the mechanism most gut health content never reaches. You don't just need good bacteria in a vague, general sense. You need the specific bacteria that produce butyrate, fed by the specific fiber they ferment. Not all fiber does this equally. Not all bacteria perform this function. The precision of that relationship is what determines whether your gut lining stays intact or begins to loosen. In 2018, researchers at UC San Diego published one of the most significant microbiome studies ever conducted, the American Gut Project, drawing on data from more than 10,000 participants. One of the clearest findings: people who ate 30 or more different plant foods per week had significantly more diverse gut microbiomes than those eating 10 or fewer. Not 30 servings. 30 different foods. An apple is one. A walnut is another. A sprig of rosemary counts. Diversity itself, the range of what you eat across a week, turned out to be a stronger predictor of microbiome health than almost any other single dietary factor. Then, in 2021, researchers at Stanford published a 10-week randomized controlled trial in the journal Cell, comparing two dietary interventions. One group ate a high-fiber diet, the other substantially increased their intake of fermented foods. The fermented food group showed a consistent, measurable increase in microbiome diversity and a broad reduction in inflammatory markers across 19 proteins associated with systemic inflammation. The results were specific enough that the lead researcher, Justin Sonnenberg, described the findings publicly as striking, noting the magnitude of the inflammatory response change was larger than the team had anticipated. The takeaway from these two studies together is not that one food category matters and others don't. It's that the gut is a layered system responding to a layered set of inputs. Diversity builds the ecosystem. Fermentation feeds the specific organisms. Butyrate production follows. Gut lining integrity follows from that. And systemic inflammation, the kind that connects to how your joints feel, how your mind works, how tired you are by 3 in the afternoon, begins to shift as a downstream consequence of that entire chain. That chain is what these 7 foods are designed to support, each one targeting a different node in the same system. Each one chosen because the evidence isn't theoretical. It's been measured, replicated, and published. Here's a pattern worth recognizing because it plays out in millions of households across the country. Someone reads about gut health. They buy a probiotic, a good one, refrigerated, multi-strain. They take it every morning. They feel hopeful for a few weeks. Then they notice not much. The bloating is still there. The fatigue hasn't shifted. They conclude that probiotics don't work for them, or that the gut health conversation is overblown, and they move on. What's happening in that scenario has nothing to do with the quality of the probiotic. It has to do with environment. Introducing beneficial bacteria into a gut environment that's actively hostile to their survival is like trying to grow a garden in soil that's still being sprayed with herbicide. The bacteria aren't the problem. What's working against them is. And in most adults over 50, there are typically 2 things doing exactly that, working silently against the gut environment every single day, that never get addressed. The first is NSAID use. Ibuprofen, naproxen, aspirin taken regularly for joint pain. These are among the most commonly used medications in adults over 50, and among the most reliably gut damaging. Research published across multiple journals, including the Journal of Gastroenterology, has documented this with consistency going back decades. Conventional NSAIDs increase intestinal permeability within 24 hours of ingestion, not with months of use, within a day. The mechanism involves inhibition of cyclooxygenase enzymes that normally protect the gut lining's mucosal layer. Without that protection, the lining becomes more vulnerable, and the bacteria you're trying to establish have a compromised surface to colonize. This doesn't mean the joint pain doesn't need management. It means that treating the joint pain with the very medication that's undermining the gut barrier creates a cycle that no probiotic and no single food can fully overcome in isolation. Both sides of that equation need attention simultaneously. The second silent saboteur is narrowness of diet. Not poor quality of diet, narrowness. Someone can eat what they genuinely believe is a healthy diet and still be feeding an increasingly depleted microbiome simply by eating the same foods in the same rotation every week. The American Gut Project data was unambiguous on this point. Diversity of plant foods eaten per week was among the strongest predictors of microbiome diversity. And it operated independently of whether those foods were organic, locally sourced, or expensive. A person eating 12 different vegetables across a week outperformed, microbiome-wise, a person eating 4 vegetables in much larger quantities. This matters practically because of something called competitive exclusion. Different bacterial species occupy different niches and require different substrates to thrive. A diet built around the same rotation of foods over weeks and months selectively feeds the same bacterial populations. And over time, the species that don't get fed simply decline. The ecosystem narrows. Resilience drops. The gut lining loses some of the bacterial diversity it needs to maintain its own integrity. What this means for anyone reading a list of 7 gut-healing foods is this. Adding these 7 foods works. But adding them into an environment where the 2 factors described above are still operating reduces their impact substantially. The gut healing process isn't additive when everything else stays the same. It's net. What you add and what you simultaneously remove from the gut's environment determines the real trajectory. The most powerful version of what comes next in this video isn't just a list of what to eat. It's an understanding of what those foods are doing and what you may need to stop doing at the same time. You've heard that fermented foods are good for your gut. That's true, but incomplete. You've heard that fiber is important. Also true, and also incomplete. What most gut health content never does is explain the specific mechanism by which each food acts on the specific repair process that matters for adults over 50, and why some foods that seem similar actually target entirely different parts of the system. Here are the 7. 1. Fermented vegetables, specifically sauerkraut, kimchi, or kefir, consumed daily. The Stanford Cell study placed fermented foods at the center of the most significant gut health finding of the last decade. A consistent daily serving, even a modest one, a quarter cup of sauerkraut, a small glass of kefir, introduced measurable increases in microbiome diversity and drove reductions in systemic inflammatory markers over 10 weeks. The bacteria in these foods are alive and active. They aren't just modifying what you already have, they're adding to it. 2. A broad weekly rotation of plant foods, actively managed toward 30 or more different varieties. This is the American Gut Project finding translated into practice. It isn't a single ingredient, and it's a habit of intentional variety. Lentils one day, white beans another, a new herb, a different color of bell pepper. Each one counts toward the weekly total, and each one feeds bacterial species the others don't. The 30-plant target isn't a ceiling, it's a threshold above which microbiome diversity shows a consistent, measured improvement. 3. Extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed, consumed fresh, approximately 2 tablespoons daily. Researchers at the Monell Chemical Senses Center, publishing in the journal Nature in 2005, identified a compound in fresh extra virgin olive oil called oleocanthal. Oleocanthal inhibits cyclooxygenase 1 and cyclooxygenase 2, the same enzymes that ibuprofen targets, through a similar molecular mechanism. The anti-inflammatory effect of roughly 50 grams of fresh extra virgin olive oil daily was compared by the researchers to approximately 10% of a standard adult ibuprofen dose. That comparison matters here because it positions olive oil not just as a healthy fat, but as a direct, mechanism-specific anti-inflammatory agent, one that works on gut barrier integrity rather than against it. Unlike the NSAID, it partially parallels. 4. Asparagus, leeks, or Jerusalem artichokes, each rich in inulin, consumed several times weekly. Inulin is a prebiotic fiber with a specific affinity for feeding bifidobacteria, a bacterial genus consistently associated with stronger gut barrier function and lower systemic inflammation in adults over 50. Prebiotics differ from probiotics in that they don't introduce bacteria. They selectively feed bacteria already present. Asparagus, eaten roasted or raw, delivers among the highest concentrations of inulin of any commonly available vegetable. 5. Wild blueberries or mixed berries, a half cup daily. Polyphenols, the compounds that give berries their deep color, have a distinctive property that sets them apart from most nutrients. 90 to 95% of dietary polyphenols reach the colon unabsorbed. They arrive intact at the site where gut bacteria can act on them, breaking them down into smaller bioactive compounds that then exert direct antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects on the intestinal lining itself. Blueberries, particularly the wild variety, carry among the highest polyphenol concentrations per serving of any widely available fruit. 6. Bone broth. 1 cup daily or several times weekly. Bone broth provides 2 substrates your gut lining uses for direct structural repair: collagen and glutamine. Glutamine is the primary fuel source for enterocytes, the same cells that make up the gut lining. And research has shown it supports the integrity of tight junctions, the protein connections between cells that prevent unwanted substances from crossing the barrier. This distinguishes bone broth from most other gut-supportive foods. It isn't primarily feeding bacteria. It's directly feeding the cells of the gut wall. 7. Fresh ginger. A thumb-sized piece 3 to 4 times weekly, grated into food or tea. Gingerols, the active compounds in fresh ginger, have been shown in clinical research to accelerate gastric emptying and improve gut motility. Delayed gastric emptying is common in adults over 50 and contributes directly to bloating and discomfort after meals. Ginger doesn't just reduce symptoms, it addresses the mechanical function underlying them. Studies have documented measurable improvement in gastric emptying time within days of consistent use, not weeks or months. 7 foods, 7 different mechanisms, each one targeting a different node in the same repair system. Here's the detail that doesn't appear in most gut health conversations. And it's the one that changes whether what you've just heard produces real results or stays theoretical. In 2021, the same Stanford research group that conducted the cell study also published an analysis of what happened to study participants who increased their fiber intake without simultaneously increasing fermented foods. The fiber group showed less pronounced improvement in microbiome diversity than expected. The fermented food group showed the more significant change. The researchers concluded, carefully, because the science of why is still being investigated, that in a depleted microbiome, introducing the substrate for bacterial fermentation without first repopulating the bacteria capable of fermenting it may produce a different result than in a microbiome with sufficient bacterial diversity to utilize that substrate. In plain language, if your microbiome is already depleted, adding more fiber without also adding fermented foods may produce less benefit than you'd expect, because there may not be sufficient bacteria present to ferment that fiber into butyrate. The sequence matters. Fermented foods first, to repopulate and diversify. Prebiotic fiber alongside, to feed what you're building. That order is not arbitrary. It reflects the biological reality of a system that needs both live organisms and the fuel for those organisms at the same time. There's a second layer to this that almost no gut health content addresses directly: alcohol and its specific relationship to the microbiome. Research has shown that regular alcohol consumption, even at moderate levels, 2 to 3 drinks several times a week, selectively suppresses certain beneficial bacterial populations, including lactobacillus species that fermented foods are specifically trying to introduce and establish. You can eat the sauerkraut every morning. If you're regularly drinking in the evenings, you're partially working against the reestablishment of the very bacteria the sauerkraut introduced that day. This isn't a moral judgment about drinking, it's a mechanistic one. The gut doesn't distinguish between good intentions and biochemical reality. What matters is whether the environment supports bacterial establishment. And alcohol, at regular intervals, makes that environment less hospitable to the bacteria most important to gut barrier integrity. The third factor connects back to something from Block 4, stress hormones. Cortisol, produced in response to chronic stress of any kind, whether psychological or physiological, directly reduces the production of mucin, the protein gel that coats your gut lining and provides a first layer of protection between your bacteria and the cells of your intestinal wall. Less mucin means a thinner protective layer. A thinner protective layer means bacteria and their byproducts have more direct access to the cells underneath. And that means the gut lining is working in a permanently compromised environment, regardless of what you eat. The gut repair process outlined in Block 5 requires adequate mucin production to work at full capacity. And adequate mucin production requires cortisol levels that aren't chronically elevated. Sleep deprivation raises cortisol. Social isolation raises cortisol. Untreated chronic pain raises cortisol. These aren't lifestyle suggestions floating independently of gut health. They're biochemically connected to the same repair process these 7 foods are trying to support. What this produces is a more complete picture than any 7-food list on its own can provide. A system that responds to what you feed it, what you expose it to, and the baseline physiological environment in which the repair is being attempted. All 3 are simultaneously in play. The foods are the most actionable lever you have access to starting today. The others, alcohol frequency, stress, sleep, are the context that determines how far those foods can actually take you. Here's what changed for Margaret. She was 63, had been dealing with what her gastroenterologist called functional digestive issues for nearly 8 years. Bloating after most meals, irregular bowel movements, fatigue that she'd quietly accepted as the price of being in her 60s. She had tried elimination diets, had done 2 rounds of antibiotics for suspected bacterial overgrowth, had spent a considerable amount of money on supplements that produced modest and temporary results. What she hadn't done, because no one had framed it this way, was address the underlying ecosystem rather than the symptoms. She started with 2 changes: a 1/4 cup of fermented vegetables with her lunch each day, and a conscious effort to eat at least 5 different plant foods she hadn't eaten the previous week, every week. Not a diet overhaul, not a supplement stack. 2 habit changes. 6 weeks later, the afternoon fatigue had shifted enough that she noticed it. 8 weeks in, she described the change in her digestion as the most significant she'd experienced in a decade. Margaret's story isn't an anecdote about miracle foods. It's an illustration of something the research consistently supports. When you address the ecosystem itself rather than trying to manage individual symptoms, the downstream effects can be broader and faster than people expect. Because the gut lining regenerates every 5 to 7 days, and because the bacteria feeding that process respond relatively quickly to sustained dietary change, the timeline for noticeable improvement is shorter than most chronic health interventions allow for. This is also why the framing matters so much. Most people approach gut health the way they approach a problem to be solved. Take a supplement, do a cleanse, follow a protocol for 30 days, and stop. But the gut isn't a problem to solve. It's an ecosystem to manage continuously, with the same consistency you'd bring to any living system that requires regular input to stay functional. A garden that you water twice and then abandon doesn't demonstrate that watering is ineffective. It demonstrates that consistency is the mechanism. The 7 foods in this video are not extraordinary foods. Fermented vegetables, berries, olive oil, prebiotic-rich vegetables, bone broth, ginger. These are ordinary ingredients available in any grocery store. What makes them worth an entire video is the precision with which each one targets a specific part of the repair process and the research base that backs that targeting with more than general health claims. If you've been dismissing gut health content as oversimplified, that skepticism is reasonable. Most of it is. This is different because the mechanism matters as much as the recommendation. You understand now why fermented foods before fiber, why fresh olive oil and not just any fat, why the diversity target of 30 plants per week rather than eating one superfood in large amounts. That understanding is what converts a list into a practice, and a practice maintained over weeks is what produces the changes the research has measured. This is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists to have. Not symptoms in isolation, not supplements without mechanism. The full picture. What's happening? Why it matters? What to do about it? Delivered in enough depth that you can make decisions based on understanding rather than hope. If that's what you're looking for, stay close. There's a great deal more of this ahead. Go back to the beginning of this conversation. That bloating that starts before you finish eating. The fatigue at 2 in the afternoon. The joint stiffness that arrived sometime in your 50s and decided to stay. You were told it was aging, a natural consequence of the years accumulating. Something to manage with ibuprofen and rest, and maybe a probiotic if you were inclined. What this video has made a case for is something fundamentally different. That those symptoms are downstream consequences of a compromised gut barrier, feeding systemic inflammation, affecting systems far beyond your digestive tract. And that the gut barrier is not a fixed condition but a dynamic system regenerating itself every 5 to 7 days, every week, every month, for as long as you live. That regeneration doesn't require medication. It doesn't require a specialist or a diagnostic procedure. It requires the right raw materials delivered consistently to a system that is already running the repair process, whether you're paying attention to it or not. The distinction between eating to satisfy hunger and eating to support a specific biological process is not a minor one. Most people have never had it explained. The typical 15-minute primary care appointment doesn't have room for it. The typical health content treats food as a collection of nutrients, rather than as signals to a living ecosystem that determines the state of your inflammation, your immune function, your cognitive clarity, and your energy, simultaneously, continuously, every day. 7 Foods is not a comprehensive solution to every health challenge, but 7 foods, chosen with precision, targeting the mechanisms that govern gut barrier integrity, microbiome diversity, and systemic inflammation, is a meaningful starting point that the research supports. Fermented vegetables to repopulate. Diverse plant foods to sustain the ecosystem. Extra virgin olive oil for its direct anti-inflammatory mechanism. Prebiotic vegetables to selectively feed bifidobacteria. Berries for the polyphenols that arrive intact at the colon. Bone broth for the enterocytes that need glutamine directly. Ginger for the motility that reduces the bloating. The other foods are trying to resolve at the source. Each one doing something specific. Each one working with the others. Each one producing an effect that compounds over the 5 to 7 day regenerative cycle of the gut lining it's supporting. This isn't hope, it's mechanism. And mechanism is what this channel is built around. If today's conversation gave you something you'll use, not just remember, but actually use, share it with someone over 50 who's been told their digestive problems are simply the cost of aging. They deserve to know the full picture. Leave a comment with the food from this list you're most likely to start with, the one that fits most naturally into how you already eat. That's the one most likely to actually become a habit, and habits sustained over weeks are where the research says the change becomes measurable. Your gut lining is replacing itself right now. The version it builds next week depends on what you do between now and then. Start today. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional.